All right, we're going to go ahead and get started here. I apologize for being a little late. I know we had some members who are interested in. They're interested in all of these agencies, but I know Natural Resources was one, and I think maybe another meeting. I think maybe they might have one or two may have actually forgotten about this meeting or something. But anyway, we have. I call the meeting to order. This is the House Appropriations. General Appropriations Subcommittee, and appreciate everybody coming. And we're taking up reviewing agencies' requests, or actually reviewing the governor's recommendations for the 07 amended budget. That's the only thing. The 07 amended budget's the only thing we're looking at this time, and we'll ask you to come back later, another date, when we begin looking at the 08 general budget. And first on the agenda today is Natural Resources. So if you would please come up and make your presentation, we would appreciate it. If you have any handouts or anything, and if you do, and if you are referring to a particular document, whether it's the governor's handout or whatever, please, if you would refer to a page, and if a line item is on there, we'd appreciate that also.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I will be using the tracking sheet that you should all have. That's the only thing Thank you very much for being here. Dr. Capps is what the presentation. If you look on the tracking sheet, the hazardous waste for wildlife resources. To provide funds for heating and air in Rhodes Hall. We currently have a lease in that facility, but we've been operating without a lease. We've taken a couple looks at issues there over the last few months. One had to do with the handicap and disabled accessibility of the building. We've worked with the Dr. Abrams and her staff to alleviate those issues. And the other was to finish funds to renovate the heating and air conditioning. That particular building does not have heating and air conditioning in most of it, other than some window units that are very inefficient. And you'll see $690,000 to complete that renovation that was started a number of years ago. Moving to the Wildlife Resources Division, we have the very first environmental education center that the Wildlife Resources Division started at Arrowhead a number of years ago. The dam, and it's an aquatic education center, the dam that held the water around which the aquatic education center functioned began failing, and the department or the division drained that facility, and we now have an aquatic education center lacking in aquatics. So we've asked money to renovate that dam and reflood it to teach those students up in Floyd County about the aquatic issues that face this state. They do monitoring. They actually learn to fish up there, and that is desperately needed. We've tried to handle that through end-of-year funds that we could accumulate with the department. We've just never been able to accumulate those dollars, and the governor was good enough to give us those funds, and they are desperately needed for that facility. The second thing under Wildlife Resources that I'll mention, and I'm sure you're familiar with this particular item after the governor's State of the State address, is the Go Fish initiative. That's a three-pronged approach. As you've heard, it has to do with increasing access, promoting the state, and increasing the habitat. One of the things that you've probably heard about is the Bass Trail and the development of a series of mega ramps around the state that will not only help our resident anglers, private anglers, but will also help Tier 1 communities principally go after some of these large tournaments that bring millions and millions of dollars to these rural parts of the state. We've identified about 15 different reservoirs or large bodies of water around the state that would be compatible with a mega ramp. but we want to work with those individual communities. We don't think all of them will be ready to partner with us at any given time. Probably half to a third of those will be ready to begin a partnership relationship where they not only help put money into development of the ramps, but they also make a commitment to go after these tournaments. So we will be working with those communities throughout the state to identify the ones that are ready to go and to work with them to get these tournaments into this state. I do want, as an aside, mention that the state of Alabama put about $20 million into a similar program to develop 5 sites in Alabama. A couple of those are right on the Georgia-Alabama line. They actually fish in Georgia, but the hotels, restaurants, and all the gas stations and infrastructure happens on the Alabama side. They tracked a return on investment over 2 years of $120 million of that 20 that they put in. And it's just a shame they're fishing in Georgia waters and spending their money in Alabama. So we want to equalize that issue a bit and make the state of Georgia very competitive in this arena. Those events, some of them bring millions and millions of dollars into these communities in a very, very short 3 or 4 day period. They're nationally advertised, and it's a huge growing industry across the United States. Finally, I want to point out that we need to true up the Wildlife Endowment Fund. This is the fund that we get money for lifetime licenses, and then we put it into the fund, and this trues that up along with some interest that's due. We just underwent an audit with the federal Fish and Wildlife agencies, and we came to the conclusion that that's along with what we know we owe in terms of licensed sales this past year, there was a small interest issue that we've come to a consensus on, and this will true that fund up and get us in compliance with the Fish and Wildlife Service. So is there any questions at this time before I turn it over to Dr. Couch? I'm sure.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I guess I get to ask a lot of questions, but maybe that's our job here. I've got a little interest, especially with the amount of money in the budget for the fishing initiative. As you mentioned, you currently don't have confirmed sites or partners and are looking into it. About how long do you anticipate it would take to go through that process of looking and establishing these partners and coming up with the locations?
We know the general locations, some of the big reservoirs. The challenge with us is that many of these overlap 2 or 3 different counties.
Certainly. And
we'll have to develop those relationships with both cities and counties in those general areas. And we have, our folks in the fisheries section have those relationships already. They've had some dialogue. We know that there's counties out there like McDuffie County and Columbia County that are already capitalizing on this and have mega ramps that bring a lot of money in. So, I can't predict exactly how long it is, but, we've done a lot of the background work already, but we have not selected any sites.
Okay, and I assume because these sites are on or are near waterways that there's going to be a lot of, anytime you touch a waterway, whether it's a ramp or trying to protect anything, there's a lot of EPD studies. I just went through 2 years of trying to shore up a bank that was trying to eat away an American Legion post. So I know how long these things can take. So I guess I'm assuming that it would take at least 5-6 months not only to shore up these partnerships, but to even start the actual planning, architectural planning, etc. of this, but I doubt if any construction on these things could start in the next 5 months. Would that be a pretty fair statement?
That's probably a fair statement, yes, sir. And to echo your concerns is the Corps of Engineers who run some of these lakes, we would have to modify lease agreements with them, and some of those could take some time, but we could obligate dollars, I think.
I guess with that and the lengthy process, as we know, there's a lot of going out and working with hotels and trying to get all this set up. It's a very lengthy planning process, and my question is really, why would we need the $13 million in the next 5 months when we're still going to be the early planning stages? Would not that money be better put out into 08 and perhaps 09 when those are the years that we'll actually start to need the money to even begin to do the planning? And maybe there should be a number designed for, there's going to be costs in the studies, and I certainly understand that. But I cannot see, especially when the governor is saying there's no money in the budget and we desperately need money for education, and there's educational facilities being cut off this year in '07 that were in the budget a couple weeks ago, that I'm looking at it overall in our budget. Perhaps we need to put in some of the monies to perform the studies and do what we need to do in '05, and then in '07, and then look at putting more money in '08 and '09 when the actual costs would start occurring, or prior to them occurring, so you can let the contracts. So that's my overall concern on this.
Let me remind you, too, that the mega ramps are only one prong of a three-prong initiative on this. There are other things that will be happening concurrent with that in terms of habitat improvement and promotion of the fishing in Georgia. So it's not all just the actual earth or brick and mortar of developing ramps. So there are a lot of things going on.
Certainly, that's why I think there should be some money. It's just my thought of, do we need that much money in the next 4.5 to 5 months on this project? Thank you very much, and thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir.
We have, and I'm not sure who asked first, but I'm going to call on Chairman Mills. What's your number?
23. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a couple of questions along, of course, the Go Fish initiative, which I represent a portion of Lake Lanier, which I want you to know that we stand ready to partner with the state, and would hope that the sites that are being looked at will certainly take into account investments that the state has already made previously to build on those, such as some of our state authorities. And I confess my bias to the Lake Lanier area, but we have great tournaments already in existence, and certainly would hope that our local communities could work with DNR and the state in trying to get one located on Lake Lanier.
In fact, when we were working with the Office of Planning and Budget and some of the governor's staff and working on this initiative, we went to Lake Lanier to one of those tournaments. Lake Lanier's done an excellent job with that, and I concur with your assessment. That's why you'll see that some of this is concurrent with our facilities that already exist on some of these large lakes with our state parks. So we want to use the facilities we have to the extent practicable. You've got to take into account the size of these mega ramps, so you can launch the number of boats that it takes to host one of these major tournaments. That's they're nationally televised, so there's a lot of infrastructure that goes with that, and it's a balancing act between the state parks and its mission, and also the economic development for those communities. But Lake Lanier is certainly one of those sites that we're looking at. There's not been anything picked up there, and again, that's one of the sites with the Corps of Engineers that we'll have to work with them very closely on that issue.
As part of the effort in partnering, along with, we all know this is a large amount of money in any budget, particularly in a supplemental budget, but it would seem to me that part of the thinking may be that this is a nice bait to invite and entice the private sector to maybe want to join up with us as well. Are there some thinking along those lines as far as your Bass Pro Shops, other big fishing businesses that might partner with the state and help take on some of this, particularly since it would help their industry so much?
I can tell you, since the announcement was made, there's been a lot of calls from fishing clubs and various organizations around the Southeast and certainly within the state of support. There's not been any outreach at this point in terms of asking them for any money to enhance this initiative. I suspect that's certainly a possibility, but I do know that the way the governor feels about this is that he wants the local communities to put something in to make these dollars go as far as they can. So I think you'll see us trying to partner with a local county or municipality to do in-kind work, to commit to assisting with public safety issues that may be centered around these facilities, and certainly promoting the facilities through the local convention bureaus or the Chamber of Commerce.
Thank you.
You bet. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Commissioner. First of all, I've heard good comments from my fellow legislators about this project. If I've heard anything from members of the Appropriations Committee, they're uncomfortable voting a block amount of money, and that it would help with our deliberative process to have some specifics for us to look at. So if at all possible, Mr. Chair and Commissioner, before we get to that part of it, are there some numbers that you can actually give us to break down?
I am very hopeful that as the session moves forward and we've had a time to start developing some plans and rolling out what we hope to do, that I'll have those for you. I do have, and I'll pass these out now, location maps of, and again, this is just simply one component of this, but tentative location maps of where some of these mega ramps could exist. So I'll pass that out and right now, and you can take a look at that.
Okay, I had a couple more questions too.
Yes, ma'am.
A clarification, we've pretty much had our conversation about freshwater. Are we also considering saltwater fishing as well?
In the promotion, yes, ma'am. In the promotion, I think you'll see that. There's also in the big budget, you're going to see we've got money in there for renovation of 4 saltwater ramps that desperately need renovation. The tides on Georgia fluctuate 8 to 9 feet daily, twice daily, and those ramps, not only because of the huge use, but because of the physical characteristics of the Georgia coast, take a tremendous amount of abuse. So we do have some collateral money in there to look at those ramps, and they will be a part of this. And you can see one of the proposed sites is on the lower Savannah that could potentially be used for promotional activities, a mega ramp on the Savannah River. But again, we haven't developed a site down there, but it's certainly one we've identified as potential.
And then just one more point to make, Mr. Chair, if I may. One of the things that I think is a benefit to the state that maybe our Natural Resource Committee would think about and others might not, is for these lakes or our areas where we are going to have fishing tournaments. One of the things we have to promote is that we have good fish. So in other words, our waters have to be at a very high standard, which is something we're trying to achieve statewide. So to my fellow committee members, just to point out to you that as we are striving to make this a reality, we're also achieving better standards for our water.
And I fully agree with that, and I do want to point out again, this is a three-prong approach, and having good habitat, good fish stocks. We don't want to invite everybody down here and then have them have a disappointing trip. So we not only have to have the access ready, we've got to have the ability to distribute people to the kind of fishing they want, which led to your question on the coast, but also have that positive fishing experience. So next year, they want to come back to Georgia instead of traveling all the way through and go to Florida or wherever they may be going. So I agree with you wholeheartedly.
Thank you, Commissioner. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thank you. Let's see. Representative Golick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A few points to go to Chairman Mills' comments from before. I think it is a very natural offshoot, if you will, that this type of initiative will absolutely, from an economic development standpoint, in my opinion, serve as a magnet for facilities such as the Bass Pro Shop, which is the one that comes off to the top of my head. I'm sure there are others, and for some of the communities, I would think, in our rural parts of the state, that those will be economic development giants in terms of having a positive impact on the community. So I agree with you 100%. And I think we haven't really even scratched the surface on what the possibilities are in terms of the economic development, just even the possibilities that will go along with this for really a very minimal investment. Commissioner, let me go ahead and and I wanted to also acknowledge Chairman Mills for his ability to work the word bait into the conversation about this initiative from an economic development standpoint. I wish I had thought of it myself. Commissioner, let me address a point that Chairman Hill brought up and ask you if my point of view on it is a reasonable one. Chairman Hill brought up the point of if we're primarily in the developmental stage right now on this, would it not be best to go ahead and hold off on appropriations until such time that we have hammered out agreements. My response to that would be, but I want to check the reasonableness of it with you as someone who's closer to the issue than I am. I would think that on a project-by-project basis, there are going to be very different dynamics. You could have a Corps of Engineers lake, you could have perhaps a Georgia Power lake, whatever it may be, and there will be different nuances to each and every project, as opposed to holding off now and then not being able to pull the trigger on a certain project with certain requirements, let's say in October, November, December. I would think that we would not want to wait until coming back next year. If we have an opportunity, we need to go ahead and act. When the deal is ripe to be consummated, and as a result, we want to err on the side of caution and appropriate those funds now, so that the folks who would go ahead and consummate that deal, including yourself and your folks, would have the ability and the resources to go ahead and pull the trigger at just the right time. Is that a reasonable approach on a project-by-project basis? Is that a reasonable defense as to why the appropriation should be made now, so that you've got the resources to go ahead and act?
I think you're exactly on target. And as in the discussions we had earlier this week with the full Joint Appropriations Committee, I don't intend to lose a dollar of this. We're going to spend the money where the governor wants it spent to bring these economic engines into these principally Tier 1 counties, I believe you'll see. And you're exactly on target with that.
All right. I think it would be Chairwoman Smith made I think a credible point, and that is that to the extent that the department can sooner rather than later lay out some specs, I think everyone at this table understands that from a development standpoint, you're not exactly sure where these are all potentials at this point. To the extent the department can help the committee in laying out some specs as they exist right now with regard to the line item of the $13 million, I think that would be helpful in terms of going forward. Is that something that y'all can do?
Well, if you'll pardon my pun, we've got folks tackling that problem right now, and we certainly don't want to do a bait and switch with this group. So we are going to be very accurate in what we do, and we will bring you something back.
Is there, and I guess from Mr. Chairman, I'm not speaking for the committee, but I would think that that's something that the committee would like to see sooner rather than later, from what I hear.
I hear you loud and clear.
Thank you, Representative Gowick. I think Representative Black had a question. Is that right?
Yeah.
Did you have a question?
Mr. Commissioner, looking at your map, you got the sites, potential sites designated with the fish signal. But then you got these towns, like a bull ride or something, that maybe designate some of the facilities.
No, sir. Those are just to give you a relationship to where those sites are in the state. They mean nothing other than just to give you a physical location in the state.
You off on both. You got about Austin, Echo County.
You're right. I need to talk to my GIS guys.
Representative Black, do you have anything else? Representative Black, do you have anything else?
No, I'm sorry.
Okay, thank you. Representative Chairman Williams.
Commissioner, this $13 million we're talking about, is that really a startup cost? Do you anticipate more funds having to be allocated to perfect these sites?
It depends on how this project goes. There's certainly things that could be done to enhance this. This will get us down the road. I think I can instill in you a sense of comfort that these are real dollars on your investment. And like anything, we can march down the road to continue to improve fishing until this body says, you've reached the point that we think we want to go. So I wouldn't mislead you to say that, you give us this and we walk away from it. We certainly could, I believe, particularly if we go after private dollars and do some things that we think are feasible out there with private dollars. But, this will be a substantial start for us, and you'll see some immediate return on your investment with this fund.
As these things come on board and being used, it ought to bring revenue to the state that really would be self-sufficient.
No question. I had the opportunity to go to the opening of the latest Bass Pro Shop down in Macon in that warehouse, and it was just phenomenal, the number of people that came to that. I talked to the owner, and the numbers they talked about that were going to be spent that night in 4 hours from the time we opened it until the time they closed were just staggering to me. So fishing is big business. We started this conversation actually with 2 or 3 people around last year. Since I've been director and been commissioner, you guys come to me from time to time talking about a boat ramp in this county or on that river or on this body of water. And I've talked to Representative Smith, Senator Tollison, Senator Mullis, that you guys think about these as a local initiative. In the department, we think about this collectively, what they mean to the entire state. And we started working on this at the urging of these folks to put this in a context of business, return on investment, and how big this is to the state of Georgia. And I don't think anybody really appreciates how much money, particularly in these Tier 1 counties with mom-and-pop bait stores and places like that, those are desperately needed dollars, and those are ecotourism dollars that don't go out of state. They're here to stay. So, and we own the world's record largemouth bass. Texas, California, and Florida are actively trying to take that title from us, and you can bet when they do, if they do, and I don't think they will, they're going to promote the heck out of that in their states.
One last question, and are the general public will still continue to have access to these ramps? It's not just restricted to tournaments only.
You are absolutely correct. The tournaments, some of them will be on weekends. Some of them, they'll be, if you have a huge tournament, those may be once or twice a year. There'll be local bass clubs that may be using them one weekend a month, but for the majority of the time, they're going to be there for the general public to use.
Thank you.
Commissioner, one last question. Does this mean when this is successful that we are then out of the golf course business?
No, ma'am. But this does mean we're going to make money.
All right. Thank you.
Oh, I'm sorry. Excuse me.
And I apologize to the other agencies. I should have allotted more time for. I don't know why I'm getting this feedback. Should have allotted more time for natural resources today. You had mentioned. I apologize. Excuse me. You had mentioned lakes where people fish in Georgia but spend money in Alabama. I apologize. How would this help that situation?
If in fact we determine that we can build through a partnership lakes on or mega ramps on Clark Hill, Hartwell, Richard B. Russell, Eufaula, Seminole, we will compete directly, working with the cities co-located with those facilities on the Georgia side to get those tournament fishermen staying in the Holiday Inn, the Days Inn, the Econ Lodge, or whatever it may be, or a state park lodge on the Georgia side, as opposed to doing that on the Alabama, South Carolina, or Florida side. Coincidental to that, they'll be eating in those Georgia restaurants, buying gas in those Georgia gas stations, as opposed to doing it in Alabama or our sister states.
Am I on? You should be. Okay. Any other questions for the committee? Thank you, Commissioner.
Thank you, sir.
Good morning.
Dr. Couch.
Good morning to you all. I would like to cover with you an item on your tracking sheet, which is item 34.4, and I'd like to hook you on the notion that providing funds to meet the statutory obligations of the Solid Waste Trust, the Hazardous Waste Trust Fund to fund the obligations for local governments is an important investment of the supplemental dollars. The amount of funding that the governor is proposing in his budget request to you for the Hazardous Waste Trust Fund FYO supplemental is shown on your tracking sheet as a little more than $6.3 million. let me talk to you just in overview in terms of what those funds would be applied toward. The large majority of those funds, in the order of about $5.5 million, as authorized and required by obligation of the trust fund statute, goes to compensate and reimburse local governments for expenditures that they have already incurred on the cleanup of local abandoned sites. So the majority of this dollar would go to, these dollars and requests would go to compensating 71 communities throughout the state of Georgia for already incurred obligations and reimbursement under the statutory obligations. The second component of the funds is that per, again, the state statute, 10% of any authorizations or appropriations of the Hazardous Waste Trust Fund would be by statute. 10% of those funds would be applied to the Pollution Prevention Assistance Division of DNR. The remaining balance, a little more than $100,000, would be applied to the work on a landfill, a Ben Gober landfill in Gwinnett County. This is a project that we can start with $100,000 this year, and I will be back before you talking about the FY 08 continuation budget on the specific projects of which the Ben Gober landfill is a high priority for 08 spending. That's an overview of the request, the dollars, and what they would be applied for. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director, my impression, if you could give us just a sort of a brief history of time in terms of the fund itself, my best recollection is that we have proactively taken a incremental increase step with regard to the fund. Can you give us an overview of where we've been on the fund,
right,
and where we are now and where we're going?
I believe it was in 2003, the legislature chose to fund the amount of funds that would be available in the trust fund to a level that was essentially one-half of what was available. And I think over the last couple of fiscal cycles, we've moved to go back to the type of funding arrangement between the continuation and supplemental budget that had been in place during large part of the first decade of the fund before we got into the budget shortfalls and situation of the state a few years back. Last year, the governor and legislature fully funded the trust fund dollars on the hazardous waste, and this is a continuation of that. And so, in essence, we're back firing on all cylinders, so to speak, with the opportunity to invest these trust funds for the authorized purposes.
That's great. Thank you, Director.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Director, of these hazardous waste trust fund, is this also where the $1 fee on tires? Does it not go into this?
No, sir. The $1 fee on tires is used to fund the solid waste trust fund.
Okay, that's a solid waste.
Yes, the fees that are in this fund come from the charges or fees that are assessed on generators of hazardous waste in the state.
Okay, and roughly what is the total amount of the fund?
It varies from year to year, but it's a little bit more than, I think, $16 million.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Director Couch, you mentioned one thing in here, the 10% that goes to the pollution prevention.
Yes.
I think that's an important step the state has taken to work with our industries. If you could take just a minute to explain it to this committee, I think that might be helpful for them to understand the proactive measures the state is taking with our industries.
Yes, indeed. It is an important aspect of work that the department, through the Pollution Prevention Division, does. I think the name of the division, Pollution Prevention, is pretty descriptive of what's intended to do. It works to work with businesses, large and small, to provide them with education, assistance, technical assistance, and consultation so that these industries and businesses, if they're generating hazardous waste, by way of example, have the capability and plans to actually reduce the waste generated. We spend an awful lot of time with the vast majority of this trust fund cleaning up legacy wastes that have been generated over time and may now be a legacy problem for the state because they've been abandoned. When the legislature set up the Solid Waste Trust Fund and authorized the Pollution Prevention Assistance Division, it was with a notion that while we might be focused on the cleanup, we needed to also be on the prevention side, and so they do work to prevent. The investment that is made through Pollution Prevention Assistance Division is a significant return on that investment relative to what businesses are able to reduce, but also as a return back to the state relative to the reduction of hazardous waste generation. Don't have statistics in front of you, and I'd be happy to share those. We are on a very good track record, due in part to the technical assistance offered here. I might also add that 10% of the fund is by statute to be applied to the Pollution Prevention Assistance Division. Currently, the state budget does not apply any direct appropriations outside of that fund, so it's an extremely important part of their funding.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yes, Director. Could you bring us up on the Solid Waste Trust Fund, both first off the amount of money to be collected on that $1 per tire, and also the how much of that is being put into the fund, and then also what's the status as far as reimbursing local governments for what they have done in this sector?
Okay, let me deal with your latter question first, if I might. Our priority is applying as much of the total amount of the Hazardous Waste Trust Fund as possible, with a high priority ensuring that we are meeting the reimbursements of local government. And over the last couple of years, we have made that a high priority, and I believe we are meeting practically all of the reimbursement requests. And that has resulted in our rebalancing the amount that we're applying to cleanup for state abandoned sites and ensuring that as a priority we get the reimbursed funds. As to your question on the Solid Waste Trust Fund, which is not part of the FY supplemental, I just want to clarify that. We're collecting, I think this year, a little less than $6 million. I don't have a detailed, I did not prepare a detailed presentation since I'll be back before you to talk about that at the continuation for the FY08. Is there a specific question you have that I can address or anticipate that I could come back for?
Collected, how much has been appropriated into that effort?
This year, the governor's request is to fully appropriate those funds.
Dr. Couch, I know that these funds were established to offset what the federal government failed to. We didn't qualify for federal funds to clean up some of these hazardous waste. Are there any sites out there now that the federal government would qualify for federal funds in any of these areas? Are we still having to foot it all through the state?
No, there are sites that are on a federal hazardous list, and there are few in number. I think there's less than a dozen of them in total. Those, however, are competitive nationally with federal dollars out of the federal Superfund, which has not been funded recently. And so those sites do have very complex, very costly, and significant issues that make them appropriate for the national priority list for the use of Superfund sites. But largely what we're dealing with here is the large fraction of what we can clean up in this state comes as a consequence of the state's own investment through this Hazardous Waste Trust Fund, a level of cleanup effort that would not be available to us and has not been available through the federal dollars.
The failure to the federal to fund these things, is it posing a health problem, health risk to the people of Georgia that these sites are not being cleaned up by the feds?
It is on a site-by-site basis. I can assure you there is health risk there, and we've got over 525 sites on the hazardous site inventory of the state, and all of those are such that they have been analyzed with respect to the possibility of humans being exposed through water, air, or soil to risk levels that are unacceptable. And that's what puts them on the list, and that's the very definition of why they're hazardous and should be cleaned up.
Dr. Couch, that's all the questions I see. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
We have DOAS, and if you go ahead.
Good morning.
Morning.
Again, I'm Commissioner Brad Douglas, and good morning to each of the committee members. Understanding that this is a presentation revolving around the 2007 amended budget, I'd bring your attention to page 23 of the amended budget booklet covering DOAS. And just as a reminder, DOAS manages the State Procurement Division, risk management, surplus property, fleet management, as well as document and mailing services. And the amended budget is a pretty straightforward issue in that there is a reduction of some $51,000, primarily associated with two programs, and that is the telecom savings and the procurement savings, both under the auspices of the Commission for New Georgia and those projects.
Any questions? Let me ask you, I was listening, but I didn't hear anything. Now, tell me again about, you mentioned the savings based on the recommendations of the Commission on New Georgia.
Yes, there are two elements of the savings. The first is stemming from the telecom renegotiation handled by GTA, and the second stems from various levels of procurement savings from various initiatives, strategic sourcing initiatives, that I'm operating on behalf of the state, but my agency is a customer of those contracts, supplier contracts. We identified savings for our spend as well, and so that composes the vast majority of the $51,000 for 07.
Okay, you mentioned the Commission on New Georgia, but you identified those savings.
That's correct. And
Commission on New Georgia didn't identify the savings. You identified the savings.
That's correct. And both the projects are offshoots of the original task forces under the Commission for New Georgia, of which there were several projects.
Thank you. I don't see any questions.
Thank you.
We have GTA, and then Georgia Building Authority is asked to come this afternoon. So I think GTA, if you're here, that will be the last for today, and that would get us almost back on track. That's right.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman,
Good
members
morning.
of the committee. We actually do have a handout that we'll present right now. We'll just pass them down here to the members. We don't know how much time you want to spend on it, but we wanted to at least have a takeaway for you from this meeting. It talks a little bit about not only the budget, of course, but also some other activity that's going on at GTA. I understand you're focusing exclusively this morning on the 07 budget, so we'll speak to that. We're prepared to speak to any other components of GTA and its operations. For the members of the committee who I haven't had a chance to interact with very much, my name is Patrick Moore. I'm the interim executive director for the Georgia Technology Authority. I was greener the first time I spoke to this committee than I am now, but I still know there are about 1 million questions I have to ask about how GTA is doing and what we need to do to make it a great place that it can be. We'll turn immediately to page 2 of the slide deck and get right into the 07 amended budget. As you can see, and this is what we testified to back in September to this committee, Mr. Chairman, we did not have any changes to the amended budget. So what you see is what you get. We're trying to follow the governor's directive and ensure that our budget remains flat in the amended years. We didn't see any changes, emergencies, or anything of that matter that needed addressing in the amended budget. Well, if you'll, Commissioner Douglas just spoke to the telecom savings. What happens with us is we renegotiated that contract, the telecom contract for the state, which resulted in about $27.5 million in savings over the course of the next 5 years. Those savings were passed on to the agencies through our billing rates. So that's how we've been involved in those savings and how they're transferred to the state as a whole. You'll see if there are any questions on the amended budget, we can move on to the 08 budget. Okay, all right. That's our presentation, sir. We didn't have anything in the amended, so but we came prepared to talk about anything else that you might want to talk about.
Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your presentation. We've had a few of our state agencies comment that one of their savings was due to this renegotiation, and it reflected in their budgets, and they were able to reapply it elsewhere. So I'm curious as to this process of renegotiation of $28 million on a telecom contract. So,
well, what it involved was, per the Commission on New Georgia, there was a request to take another look at what we were being charged by Bell South on these rates. And it was time to renegotiate the contract anyway. We were at the end of the contract's terms. So a GTA team with some other folks sat down with Bell South, and over the course of a couple months, were able to bang out a new agreement that's more in line with what market rates were, which is more in line with the fact that Bell South is, or GTA rather, is one of Bell South's largest clients. I believe the largest client in the state of Georgia, and was reflective of the partnership that we have with Bell South and what we want to do. So it was it was a very good renegotiation, not only in terms of the rates that we were able to achieve, but also in terms of the flexibility we have in the contract going forward. An example is the market shifts, or if rates shift within the marketplace, we have the capacity to go back to Bell South and say, we have new market conditions, we need to re-examine our contract. As customers, move over to VoIP, for instance, we have a capacity to go back and say, okay, the market's changing, we need to look at this again. So there's some flexibility built in there that's indicative of the strong partnership that I believe is growing candidly with Bell South and GTA. And it was just a good renegotiation that speaks to the purchasing power that we're able to provide as an enterprise agency.
and then one final question is, now with this merger with AT&T, how do you anticipate that to empower your agency?
I understand that there's still a lot of work to be done with that merger between Bell South and AT&T, but our understanding from Bell South is that the relationship is not going to change, that we're going to continue to have a positive relationship, and that these renegotiations and the work we're doing with Bell South is not going to shift dramatically in the near term. There's nothing they being Bell South can foresee in the short term that's really going to have an impact on what we're doing.
All right, thank you very much.
Of course, thank you.
I think that's all the questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate the time.
Fine presentation. I want to ask the subcommittee, that was the last presentation we have. GPA has asked to come this afternoon. However, Joe Doyle is here from the, don't know exactly what it is. He works with Commission on New Georgia issues. You can tell, you can present that yourself. But we do have a few minutes, and it might be a good time if we got a little presentation from him on what they're doing and how they're helping to identify savings. Some of the questions that at least I had yesterday. If you'd like to come on up. And tell us, I know you've been here before with presentations, but if you would tell us what your relationship is to the governor's office, how it fits in. We're familiar with the recommendations that were made from the Commission on New Georgia, because most of those the recommendations were implemented through appropriations that we reviewed in this subcommittee. But at this point, in the process, how exactly do you all fit into it, and what are you doing?
I'll be glad to do that, and thank you, Mr. Chair. My name is Sid Johnson. I'm Director of Implementation in the Governor's Office, as a part of the Commission for a New Georgia, and sometimes that's confusing, so let me explain that. There are two parts to the Commission for a New Georgia. One part is the Commission for a New Georgia proper. It's a nonprofit organization with leading businessmen from across the state that generate the recommendations, but a nonprofit can't implement in state government, so the governor formed an Office of Implementation, which I'm director of. So the nonprofit does the recommendations, we do the implementation. As Chairman Parsons mentioned, you have been very supportive of the Commission request for appropriations. We are implementing many projects. We've got 20-plus projects that we're working on, and several of those projects are already generating savings. And to make sure we validate those savings, we document them, and we have a systematic approach to those savings, we have formed an internal validation committee. And the members of that internal validation committee are Tommy Hills, the CFO, Shelley Nichols, the Director of Office of Planning and Budget, Lynn Valinga, who is the State Accounting Officer, me, and a fellow named Don Edwards, who's our private sector representative. He's an accountant. In fact, he's in the Accounting Hall of Fame, so we've got a lot of expertise coming in that he represents. What I've handed out, if I could walk you through this very quickly, we've to date validated 14 projects and their savings, and I'll just walk across the top part there to show you the columns. Annual or year one project savings is the first year or annual savings associated with that project. So in the telecom rate negotiation, which Commissioner Moore just presented, we had an annual savings of a little over $6 million. That deal was for 5 years, so the extended savings of that contract was $30 million over that 5-year project. Now, of course, we can only cut the budget or redirect one time, so that's $6 million is the amount that's associated with the budget change. You can see going beyond the contract horizon, you've got project proceeds. Some projects, such as the surplus real property sales, generates proceeds. That $17 million there represents a netted out amount. If we sold the building and move operations somewhere else, we tried to net out some of those costs associated with that move. Avoidance and other benefits. Some projects save money, but they're in a rising rate environment, such as the electricity project you see down there. So while we don't have a budget impact, we are mitigating cost over time. And you'll see several projects have those kind of benefits. And then finally, several local governments have the opportunity to participate in several of our procurement contracts. So what you see here, anything we save the state also accrues to local governments. So you can see kind of toward the bottom there, our new contract with PC Hardware, based on the volume of purchases by local governments in previous years, we estimate they're going to save $34 million a year moving forward. So basically that's the way we've laid it out. Now at that point, once we've validated the savings in this committee, we hand off to the Office of Planning and Budget. And they have integrated and come up with a systematic process for applying those savings into the budget. And so you see on the balance of your handout the FY07 and the FY08 distribution of savings and the resolution of those savings. Let me say that the number, going back to the front page, the number we started with and turned over to OPB was the $21,936,000 figure you see there. What they had to do, OPB had to do, was back out any Fed funds or other fund sources that weren't available to cut. They weren't state funds, basically. Had to net those out and also make any common sense adjustments and unusual spending patterns, those kind of things. And so what you see on the actual budget pages is the remainder of that money and how it was used or cut in the budget process. So hopefully that explains the process just a little bit. I would add one other thing, and that's the important role of what we're calling leading agencies. Folks like GTA, DOAS are playing a prominent leadership role in identifying these savings, putting the contracts in place to secure these savings, certifying the savings, and then bringing those savings to the committee for validation. So they are playing an important role, not in identifying and putting the contracts in place to identify, but also making sure agencies are working under the contract to actually secure the savings.
Good morning.
Good morning.
It's really encouraging and refreshing to see that we're getting down to the business principles of actual savings and recognizing and identifying them. These savings that are coming now and reflected back in the different agencies, are they going to be reflected in their budgets? In other words, if we find savings this year, not to have it forgotten about, and they come back with another budget that doesn't reflect those savings. So are we keeping up with the savings to make sure that they're properly credited or applied, that we don't come back next year and say, well, we've saved, but we need this, that, and the other? I think that the whole purpose is to reduce the cost of state government, and if we don't properly supervise and apply these, that we may lose out what we're trying to accomplish.
Yes, sir. And that, as you know, that's a struggle. And coming in, not from an accounting standpoint, much less in any other manner. What the governor chose to do on this initial year was give the agencies an opportunity to suggest redirection of their savings amount. The majority of those he went with and redirected the savings amount into the agencies. Part of that reasoning, he explained, was he wanted the agencies in the early years here to be incentivized to continue in this process and have them benefit from their efforts in saving these. So that's part of that, and the bulk of this is redirected back into the agencies. So right out of the chute, we're not cutting a whole lot. We are redirecting the bulk of it.
Thank you.
But your point is valid.
Chairman Smith.
Thank you, and essentially I'm going to just enlarge on that question. And what we go through with our process every year when we hear from our state agencies, we know now that several of our agencies benefited from your telecommunication negotiation. And so I guess the next question would be, next year, will the budget reflect a reduced telecommunications cost line, or will we notice it being reflected another way in the budget process?
I'm not an expert in budget, but my understanding is if it's redirected, the telecommunication would go down and the budget would go up somewhere else based on the redirection. So that's my understanding.
A lot of times we'll get an additional request for funds, and then we find out they may have had the savings, and then we just don't hear about it the following year. So that's why I asked that question. So,
well, we will.
And that's, I'm sure, what I was just enlarging on your question. So.
Okay. And I'll share that with Shelley Nickel, the director of OPB, and think through that, how we can keep that on the table and track that the best we can.
And then are there times even this year where the funds, if they're not redirected, they just go back to the general fund?
Yes, ma'am. You'll see on the budget pages here, there is a column that state funds eliminated, and you can see down that column.
All right. Thank you very much.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, sir, Mr. Chairman, I did. Has it been discussed, or when a savings is realized, is there any type of policy being put in place by the New Georgia that when a realized savings is accomplished, then there is a sense of expectation that the agency budget will be reduced by that specific amount?
We want to bring that policy option to the governor. I think that's our job. Here's the cuts, make it available to the governor, and let him decide through Office of Planning and Budget in conjunction with the agencies what's the best use of that money. And as we all know, we've got a lot of costs going up in a lot of areas. I think electricity cost, utility costs are going up. So it's another fund source for the governor and OPB to use to address some of these needs in the agencies. So while we're all very interested in cutting the budget outright, we want to be realistic about the rising needs of state agencies. And I think that's the balancing act that OPB and the governor has to do, and that's reflected here. Sometimes we took a cut. Most of the time it was redirected to some real needs.
I applaud what is being done. However, I share the concern of my colleagues that the losses are not going to be realized if there's not a policy in place that says, those increased costs you were just referring to, that's going to happen whether New Georgia's in existence or not.
That's right.
So there ought to be a policy in place that would realize, we would see what the savings are and be able to measure against what the increased costs are. If not, then it'll all be lost in the shuffle.
Mm-hmm. Well, the approach we're trying to do is make it all transparent. And what we could have done, I guess what we could have done was cut everything and then reappropriate, for these needs. And I think we're showing what we've done and eliminate, a cut and then an appropriation. But it's all transparent, so you can see it regardless. But I hear your point. We want to cut. We want to cut. We don't want to lose the savings. I hear that loud and clear. And we'll try to address that the best we can and keep up with the savings so we can track it over time. So if we need to make some adjustments over time, we'll be able to do that with you.
I was sitting there looking at a couple of situations where you got things like replacing high mileage vehicles. You got to figure about the savings there. Now, is this the net of what would be the projected operating costs as compared to the capital outlay of buying new vehicles, or is this just shifting some money over into purchase of new vehicles?
Can you point me to the example? And I'll do my best.
Department of Agriculture and Banking, on that first page right there, both of them, you've got replace high mileage vehicles. There's a savings of $45,000 and $58,000.
I'm going to make an assumption. I may not ought to do this, but because we didn't deal with the redirection piece, we just came up with the savings. But my guess is the $45,000 in the case of the agriculture would replace an appropriate number of high mileage vehicles, and if there's any difference, they'll use internal funds to make the difference of those vehicles. So I don't know if $45,000 covers all of them or just a portion of those high mileage vehicles. Is that the question?
Well, any person that's been in business, operates vehicles, knows that you got to make judgments as to when the maintenance cost of these vehicles is going to exceed the replacement cost. And so you can come up with a figure that says that we can replace these vehicles, and our replacement costs will not be as much as what the maintenance costs from operating. If that's the case, that's one thing. If we're just taking this much money right here and pulling it off of operating costs and you want to replace it with bonded purchases of vehicles, shifting that money over into, that's another picture.
Right, and I believe I know in the case of agriculture that those are very high mileage vehicles. Those are probably 150, 175,000 miles on those vehicles. Don't hold me to that exactly, but that's the range that those particular vehicles are in. So, yeah, they may be. So yes, I think they've done the analysis, brought that to OPB, and based on their analysis and their need, OPB made that recommendation and the governor endorsed it. I hope that addresses your question.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. Just a couple of comments I want to make. First of all, I know your name very well. I apologize for having announced it as the wrong name.
No
I've
problem.
got so many things in my mind right now. Thank you for coming. We really do appreciate you coming. Part of the confusion, we had an agency coming, and I understand, I would probably say the same thing, but this person had said the savings have been identified by the Commission for New Georgia. That's not really who you're with, as you explained. And so that was kind of some of the confusion. I appreciate you coming and explaining that. The second, now when we approved and I appreciate you telling us that, you know, your part is to identify the savings. How it's spent is somebody else's concern. But I would say when this committee approved funding to implement some of these programs identified by the Commission on New Georgia, we didn't do it with the intent of saving taxpayers money. We didn't do it with the intent of creating another funding source for the governor or OPB. Not at all. I have a little bit of concern that, you know, the way this is happening is that these savings are being identified by you all, which is fine. Should not be in any way a funding source for the governor or OPB. I mean, these are taxpayers' dollars that we're saving. That was the very intent that we're trying to implement. And so if you would just take that back, that we have a concern with that. It's the General Assembly of Georgia that decides how money is appropriated. The governor makes recommendations to us, but the General Assembly of Georgia makes those decisions.
Absolutely.
Thank you for coming today.
Yes, sir. Thank you for the opportunity.